I just said to them that it is wonderful to see that on a sunny day like today, Cape Townians are willing to sit in an air-conditioned room and listen to authors. My name is Ingrid Jones, and I have the pleasure of talking to these three, and I must be very careful how I choose my words, whether I say females or women, or so I'll leave that for later, Pumla. I'm not going to introduce them, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Normally when I'm introduced, they say things about me that's not applicable to that particular event where you are at. So I am not an author. I'm a curator of a cooking book. That tells you a lot. And I am the editor-in-chief of a couple of magazines. So that's what I do. So for today, when I prepared for coming here, other than reading 3 books, as you can see, it's hard work. People think you just come and sit here and shoot the breeze. I thought I'm going to do it as a reader, because I'm not an academic, and I'm not a very clever person, I'm very shallow. And the idea of book festivals is not just for you to come and listen to authors, but also for you to buy the books that these people have put their blood, sweat, and tears into, and that is why I'm going to engage with you as a reader. So if there are some hard questions, then it is as a reader who would like other readers to go out and purchase your books. So to my left is Azille Coetzee, Joy Watson, and Pumla. Do I say Gqola? Am I right? Thank you. So I'm going to start with you to introduce yourself. I must say I'm a little scared of Pumla because I've read and heard a lot about her, and I've read this book, I have to tell you. I had to okay, let me go back again so that I just completely understand what I just read. Because I'm 60 years old, I come from an era where these words did not exist at all. So if I put my foot into it, dear audience and authors, it is because I come from a different era where we're still learning all of these new words. So would you please and kindly introduce yourself?
I like how you say I'm turning 50 this year, so actually I don't think you can pull that whole I come from a different era with me, because thank you so much, Ingrid. Hey everybody, it's good to see all of you. Thank you for coming to spend your Sunday afternoon with us. My name is Pumla Gqola. I teach for a living, so I'm a professor of literature, and I'm a feminist author of a few books, and I'm really happy to be here. This is, it's great to be back at Open Book. And what else can I say about myself? I'm a feminist, I'm difficult, and I'm playful, and I'm usually in my best mood when I'm at Open Book. So you're getting
the good side.
And I like difficult questions.
And then there is Joy Watson. And when I read Joy's book, I'm like, I can't wait to speak to this person, because there's a lot of things happening in this one. Joy?
So I'm Joy Watson, and I just want to put a disclaimer out there. When my sister read my book, she said, "Oh my God, you have one deeply fucked up mind." So when you read the book, please take that into account. That, there might be moments where it seems like I have a deeply fucked up mind, but I'm still a nice person. I am a feminist researcher and writer, and I get to write as a contributor for Daily Maverick, where it's really just a lot of vomit of words on stuff that I think and feel and so on.
Joy, it's not a vomit of words. I am Azille Coetzee. I didn't even wait for you to. I am also a feminist researcher or philosopher at Stellenbosch University. And I kind of lead a double life. I have my feminist academic life, and then I write creatively in Afrikaans, and the two worlds rarely come together, so it's so nice when it does, when my novel can be spoken about in a feminist context, and yeah, so let me not ramble.
Okay, so I read the books I started with The Other Me, Joy's book. Then I read Azille's Die Teenoorgestelde is net so waar, because I thought, let me leave this for last. This might inform, in hindsight, what I've read in these two, but once I was done with all of it, I said I was just stupid. I should have started with this one first, and then I would have understood these two better. So let me start just with a sentence that, Pumla, you started with. It says, stories are a major way we make communal, transcendent meaning of human experience. And this, in essence, is what every author does, and what you all have done. So let me start with you, Joy. The Other Me. Now, there is a character in this book called Lolly. She is a naughty, naughty person. And then and sometimes one wonders whether the author or the storyteller and the main character might have certain characteristics in common. So would you firstly tell us about, like a little summary of, so that we all understand, if the people who doesn't have the book yet, what The Other Me is about?
Sure. So The Other Me is a story about a woman who, in some ways, I suppose, is a functioning sociopath. And at this point, I want to put out that I hope she's not me. And she, you know, I tried to write her in a way where we are at times shocked by the things that she would do, but that there's a backstory that doesn't exonerate her, but sort of hopefully makes it understand why she becomes who she is. And I wanted, in writing this character, to play with the notion of hauntings, so that we, in our sense of self, are not one person. We're made up of so many different and at times conflicting things. And when we come into spaces, we present ourselves and package ourselves dependent on what that context of that space is. And so we can be so many things, and I wanted to play with that, the many different notions and parts of ourselves, and being haunted by ourselves and the different aspects of how we're not binaries, and that there is good and bad within us, and that we can oscillate between those two.
So just for context also, if you look at the stage, and we live in South Africa, so if you say you're colorblind, then you're not from here. So the character Lolly in Joy's book grows up in a colored area. Then she does something and she's adopted into a white family. And then she assimilates completely into whiteness, but in the back of her mind lives this colored woman van die yacht. Because if you mess with her, dan kom die yacht uit. So I'm going to leave that there while I move over to Azille. Similarly, when I read it, I don't occupy a white world. So now I'm having to read about women and a couple of guys in her book, and I get to understand how some things work. But before we get there, do you want to tell our audience what it is about?
So it's a book about 3 young women who are good friends and who've been friends for most of their lives. And I think in the book I explore female friendship mostly, but of course entangled with other forms of kinship and romantic love and sex. but I follow these three women for a few years and look at how their relationship to one another changes and evolves, and also in context with different romantic relationships that I have going on. The novel starts when the one woman gets married. So for me, I wanted to, I'm at a point where many of my friendships are, with my female friendships are changing because of this age where we are in, and people are getting married and having babies, and we change, and I wanted to look at, I come from a culture where we prioritize the heterosexual nuclear family, and I wanted to see what happens if in a story in Afrikaans where I center a friendship between three women rather than centering the romantic relationships that they enter into. So that's more or less what it's about.
Pumla, I visited a friend of mine this morning before I came here, and she had to go and collect her daughter who was visiting a friend, a 16-year-old, and the brother said, why doesn't she just walk home? And so the mom said, no, but she has to cross the bridge and it will be, dangerous. And I proudly said, I've just read Pumla's book, and that billboarding of female fear is exactly what you have expressed right now. That the notion that has been so inculcated, don't dress like this, don't walk over the bridge, don't do this. And that is the part of the backstory of the Female Fear Factory. Did I do that? Was I right?
Yes, Ingrid, but I think you knew that already.
Because I read the book. I'm so scared nowadays if someone talks to me, I'm like, oh, okay, I need context. So.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that I try to speak about, obviously I live the world, I identify as a woman and as female. Well, I mean, in the book I argue we are made female, so I recognize the processes that make me female, so I'm not talking about the biological female. And that fear is a big part of how we navigate space. And I mean, I think one of the things that I try to do with this book often, because often when you write about something and you happen to be an academic, people sometimes pretend, think, not you, but people sometimes pretend like, I am the feminist fairy godmother and I live here and I'm sort of a woman, but not really. And as though these things, I'm not affected by these things myself. So this isn't what you asked me, but this is how I'll answer it. So one of the things that I share in this book is how I like to walk. I'm all of my friends are like running, and I'm not that person. I'm not gonna be a runner. I'm not even gonna jog from here to there unless I don't run unless something's chasing me, right? And I haven't been chased in a while. So I walk, but I love walking, and I walk everywhere. And I mean, obviously, I'm an older woman, I'm a middle-class woman, so some of the places where I walk are supposed to be, because we have this myth in South Africa that working-class men are dangerous and da-da-da-da. So I walk, and I tell the story of how I walk very proudly, and there's a hooting and all the nonsense that happens in the street that makes us feel unsafe. But how this one time, as I was writing this book, this man just kind of tried to beat me up. Like, it's someone who supposedly, or he looked like a homeless person. I don't know if he's really homeless. And he just tried to beat me up. I was just walking, minding my business. He said hi, I waved because I had my mask on. And then he just tried to beat me up. And so, yes, I can both relate to what your friend was saying about the worry, but I also understand absolutely, and I agree with you that that's a problem. That maybe we shouldn't be so accepting of that. But I can say that without minimizing how real that fear is, because I mean I was afraid. I mean I was stubborn and I didn't run away but I was afraid, and I was also afraid that if I didn't go out. So then I got home eventually, and then I was like, but you didn't finish your walk. And I knew that if I didn't go out on my walk immediately, it might take me 6 months to go on my walk again, or I might end up giving up walking. So yes, you were right. And yes, that fear is real and needs to be disrupted.
How does the fear factory, female fear factory, work?
So it's a factory because I think that the fear is constantly being produced, right? And it's produced in ways that force us to witness it. So that was why it was important for me not to just talk about fearful people and patriarchy's fear, but to talk about it as a factory, because I feel like we're constantly being taught and retaught and retaught and retaught to be fearful. So it's not an automatic response to something. It's produced in us constantly as part of how we are controlled. And I really think that all systems of power need fear. And so I call it a fear factory, the female fear factory, because I think that it's important to understand that it's not just it happened and now we all, the reason we're fearful is not because we're crazy. It's because we are constantly being terrorized. But when you're constantly anything, you start to think, that's just normal, and you stop seeing it. And it became important for me to say, but let's look at the ways in which we are being taught, how it's being performed constantly. We're being trained into it. And it happens in public and in private, but it happens in public, and I focus on how it happens in public. So, for example, we all know, someone was saying yesterday that if you're around very little children, you know they have no sense of self-preservation, right? They all think they're like Wonder Woman and Superman and whatever. They like want to dive. They think they can fly, and you're like, wait. So we learn to be fearful, and one of the ways in which we learn in the female fear factory is that we watch what happens to people. So we watch what happens we watch women get sexually harassed. We watch younger gay, let's say boys or men get taunted for being a certain way, and we watch how everybody keeps quiet or joins in or looks away. So we learn, that we are targets and that nobody will come to our defense. So we learn not to come to the defense of anyone else, and we also learn to know that things can happen to us. It's like a thing where you walk down the road and you're sexually harassed and you want to say, fuck off, right? And sometimes you do, but sometimes you look like, oh, there's 6 of them, and if I say fuck off, are they going to kill me? What's going to happen to me? And sometimes you do it, and and sometimes they're taken aback, but sometimes things happen. And so we live then in this. So that's how it works. That's how it works. But yes, it was important to kind of, for me to draw attention to the ways in which it's constantly being produced, and also finally that it's not just a feeling, because that's the problem. There's 2 feelings that are very important to any kind of oppression. Well, there's many: shame and fear. But we all think that fear is just a thing that I feel. It's a private emotion. It became important for me, as a feminist in the world who writes about violence against women, to think about the way in which fear is a political machine thing, not just a private emotion. And so, although it creates isolation, we all feel like it's like billions of people all feeling alone while we're all having a very similar experience. And I guess I just wanted to make those connections.
And it's not just a South African thing, as you say, it is a common language across the world. To come back to Joy, it could also have been called Murder, She Wrote. And it could also have been called How to Get Away with Murder. So the assimilation into white culture and then living a white life, and then she marries, and I want to say everything, she marries a lovely boy, Sadiq. And poor Sadiq, I felt so sorry for Sadiq. What inspired, I don't want to use the word inspired, but what brought to life those 2, because I didn't like Lolly in the beginning until I understood her. I was like, yo, bad bitch. But those are also the words that we use because we were taught that women who behave in a certain way would be called that. So how did those two characters come about?
So I think that, you know, the difficult thing about my book, and I shouldn't say this because then it's not an incentive to buy it, but a lot of the characters aren't necessarily very likable. And what I wanted to, you know, sort of was holding my feminism initially and wanting to write a feminist book and started writing a world where we didn't use words like bitch and so on. And then I realized that this is not working because this isn't how the world is. And so I had to redo this thing and put it in the real world. But what I wanted to work with was the concept of layering and no binaries and how, you know, within people we are layered and complex. And specifically to put under the lens a relationship and to look at how the dance of a relationship between two people, how it can become a manifestation of relational trauma, where on a daily basis you're living and reliving trauma that you induce through each other. And that in doing that, there's a wound on both sides and in the center, and that wound becomes so adaptive that you stop seeing it. It just by osmosis becomes part of yourself. And the pathology of living that way, and then thinking about how, because this has become the norm of the toxicity of this relationship, that it takes, you know, because you're living with that, it takes a massive rupture point to begin to think of the possibility of a canvas of a world that exists outside of this relationship, because that's how, you know, when we're in toxic relationships, how it works. Like, you normalize it and you go like, okay, but it will get better next time, and we can just fix this. And so I guess that, yeah, that was what I wanted to play with, people who are deeply layered and complex, and where, in fact, I was driving with Zadie this morning, who has been reading the book, and I said to her, who did you like more? And it was an interesting question for me, because there's lots to not like. Especially
we don't want to
between
see
these two
our ugly
people.
sides. We only want to see the good side of a person.
Yeah. And to keep, through a process of shifting revelation, to keep the reader uncertain as to where they should invest in a sort of moral higher compass. Like, I don't want you to work that out easily.
Yeah. I must say it triggered a lot of stuff for myself that I had to correct myself with, you know, in terms of my thinking. And then I read yours, and I thought, Sex in the City, for white people in South Africa. And,
Pretty much. Yeah.
See? And, but the way that the reader knows that these characters will not stay within their female roles, they're going to step out of it at some time. Because we live, I think, in an era where I'm not sure, and Pumla, please, you have to help me after I've asked Azille, of how are we moving into a genderless future? But back to this, because it begins to feel like that in your book.
You mean it begins to feel as if we're moving towards a genderless future?
Yeah, because of the fluidity that people were thinking and behaving.
I'm so glad you read it in that way. I think part of the project for me was, so my previous book was a memoir in which I basically chart my own life story so far, which takes the shape of the marriage plot. You meet someone, a white man in my case, and you fall in love, things go wrong, but in the end you end up happily together again. And I realized that this was, it was very difficult for me to imagine different kinds of stories because, and I think here I can connect to Pumla's idea of the female fear factory, that obviously it operates in highly violent ways, but it also operates in the daily ways in which women are disciplined into living their bodies and living their lives in very specific ways. And it really shapes how we inhabit the world and our relationships and the decisions we make. And the white Afrikaans culture is a highly patriarchal one that really leans on women taking certain roles and fulfilling certain functions within the nuclear family system. And so with this novel, I tried to think, what would it take to imagine a different kind of story playing out? And then, yeah, I think a big part of it is gender liberation, to move past I'm not saying discard white men, but to decenter them, to center other forms of kinship, other forms of relationship, and to live our bodies and our desires in much freer ways, which is often difficult to imagine in the context that I live, I feel. So that is what I try to do, and I'm glad you did read it that way.
Okay. So can I bounce that then to you in terms of the female fear factor? Because there's such a lot to unpack in the book, but gender, sex, male, female, that we are trying to understand as we move further into the 21st century. And when you start listening, I mean, in the previous conversation where they talked about queer people and their families, and how our families deal with all of this, do you think that there will become a day, not in my lifetime probably, that we would be able to fall in love with a person and not a gender?
I certainly hope so, Ingrid. Otherwise, I don't know, I think that, I hope that point exists in the future and not too distant future. I mean, I'm quite optimistic. I mean, I don't know how, I don't know what, I wouldn't be able to be the kind of feminist that I am if I wasn't. I do think things change. I'm a feminist. I'm also, I'm a scholar of slavery. So I really need to think that things change. I really believe it in my DNA. I know you're not supposed to believe things in your DNA, and it's an oxymoron, but I know, I believe it in my DNA. And I think that, I do believe that there's a future out there that is where we're free from gender, because I think of gender as a prison, right? So if we're thinking about gender as a prison, that locks us into certain kinds of roles and certain kinds of expectations and locks us, even more importantly, out of a range of possibilities, I certainly hope so. Do I think that we are going to create that future? Yes, I do. Do I think that we are creating it? Do I think we're starting to see the signs of it now? No. I think what we're seeing now, which is we have to be just as unapologetic about fighting, is kind of what we're seeing is just kind of the neoliberalization and co-optation of a whole range of radical critiques of gender. And so we're seeing something that looks like it's taking us seriously, but actually has so many traces of exactly what we're fighting. So I don't think we are free of gender yet. And I think it's actually, I think we can imagine it, and I think we have to imagine it, and we can only end it if we imagine it and work towards it, like ending the prison of gender. But I do think that if we start pretending right now that gender doesn't exist, that it's not a system, we're actually doing the opposite of the work of undoing it. Because we can all sit around and, because I think to pretend that gender doesn't exist now, instead of unmaking gender, is to acquiesce to the lie that the co-optation of all of our radical and all traditions of radical thought is it's a smokes and mirror thing. So yes, I believe in that future, and I hope that I'm a small part of the movement that brings us to that point, even if I'm not going to live to see it. Well, I mean, maybe we will from the other side, whatever the other side is.
The chapter, you can hear I'm from not English, chapter, not chapter. The subchapter that speaks about words, wording and worldling. Talks about how words are used in the the creation of the Fear Factory, and whether it's here, whether it's everywhere, but in South Africa and in the Western Cape specifically. Now, I can't use those two words. I will use the first letter, and you will know immediately what I'm talking about. If you live in the Western Cape and if you live in Cape Town, the P word is very familiar to you. When you talk about a woman, and if you are angry at her, if you're very clever, you might use the C word, because then you must now went to Woolies High School, that one. So, wording and words, and how do we deconstruct? Can we deconstruct that?
Yes, I think we can, and I think we have to. And I don't think that, I think some of that work has started to happen. I mean, I'm reminded of a few years ago, there was a play that the Gender Equity Office, I think it's called, at UWC plays, Mary Hames, and then it was called Reclaiming the P Word. And it was I don't know, I'm showing my age. I'm sorry for those of you who are younger than me, because my reference points are my reference points. And I'm a middle-aged woman, so, you know, it's just, it gets messy from here. For you, not for me. It gets fun for me and for Ingrid. And some of that, I mean, it was a play. It had a lot of black women on stage, and it was kind of thinking about what that word means and how it becomes, on whose bodies, you know, whose bodies were the alphabet that built the word historically, and who it, you know, how it becomes so commonplace. I think that it's important. So efforts like that, or if I'm thinking about kind of Habiba Badiroon's work that traces why it became so commonplace, and whose body is really being thought about, even though it gets used seemingly loosely, what actually the message in the public is that's being kind of created and recreated. I think there is some work in trying to deconstruct it, but I think there's too little work. And I think that we deconstruct not just by the stuff we do in kind of academic seminars, but we deconstruct really by kind of making it strange, right? And so thinking about, do I use this word? So I like that you said, I'm not going to say it, because that already says something, and maybe it says something to people who wouldn't have thought about it, right? Who would have just, because we've all socialized to kind of use it so loosely as a slur, but as an okay slur. We hear it like 500 times, you know, if just kind of walking around in Cape Town. And so I think that work of questioning it and visibly and unapologetically questioning it like you do is part of the work of deconstructing it. And I think if we make it strange enough times, it becomes more strange than normal. And I think that becomes part of how we end its villainous rule on our imaginations and our lives.
Okay, so now, sex in your book, the way the reader reads it, becomes a tool for Lolly of control. Am I right?
In some instances, I mean, Lolly likes sex, so she's also in it for the carnal pleasure. But yeah, so sometimes it's a tool.
And I'm not sure about our audience, but me, 60 years old now, when I read it, so sorry, just a disclaimer, for my 60th birthday, someone gave me a vibrator. And I was like shocked out of my wits. I'm like, am I the only person who doesn't use this? When I started talking to other people, I'm like, oh, okay, I live in the Bundus. So when I read, you know, the carnal pleasure that Lolly derives from seducing poor Sadiq, who comes from a conservative Muslim family. You know, and then they bring in another character, and I'm like, hey, I wonder what South African people are going to say about this one, or the community that I live in. So, are you like that?
I am so not answering that.
That wasn't meant to sound judgy. It's like, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to believe that we can aspire to live in a world where it's emotionally possible, and where our level of consciousness, I'm trying to choose my words so carefully, has evolved to a point where we can bring in people. That would be great. I mean, there's a whole lot of mess and complications, as happens in the book. But yeah, I mean, let me just stop there.
I'm very curious.
My daughters are in the audience. Why are you asking these things?
And then, of course, there's sex in the Afrikaner community, which the word is not used. It is alluded to. You want to, because it's not, you know it's happening, you know, but the door is closed, the lights are put off, and it talks about the male Afrikaner dominance of almost all of the eras, and but in the bedroom, these sisters is heilig. Where?
I can't wait to get to that.
So how do you deal with a conversation about sex with your friends in the book?
So I wanted to show women who enjoy sex and who pursue it and who have it when they want to have it, which is already, I think, in my culture, even though I watched the documentary recently, Sex in Afrikaans, and there they really, well, it's very interesting to see, but it seems like Afrikaans people are having a shitload of sex. But people don't talk about it that much. And you're not supposed, especially as a woman, you're not supposed, well, you're supposed to be sexy enough. You must be sexy, but you must be chaste also. So it's this fine line that we walk. So I think I wanted to portray all of that. The sex scenes, it's interesting. There was even less sex scenes in the book with my first draft. I think I was just shy to go there because I know my parents will read it. But then the publisher really pushed me to add more sex and more genitals. And so I did some of it, but still not. I was thinking my next book, I'm just going to fill with lots of very graphic sex.
I think she started already. One couple has got sex in the church door. That's already, yeah.
Well done.
Sex is not in your book. It's called rape. And from a very different perspective, from the patriarchal, the fear factory, where rape is used as a tool of enslavement. You talked about the castle of the brothel, slave brothel, where consent is never asked. It seems like it is, but it's not. And that is another way of taking away agency for gazillion of years from women. And that we try and clothe court cases in different words to soften. If it is an important male, then there's a different way of addressing him. And if it's someone we don't know, then that person is the monster. But the wealthy person will never be the monster. How does that, like you can explain from the book perspective what you mean, and then where are we with that? I mean, we have got so many well-known cases that one can talk about here and abroad, but specifically here.
So I argue strenuously that rape is not sex, that it's not any kind of sex, that it's simply, thank you, it's simply sexualized violence, right? So the part that looks like sex is the part that is part of the game of hiding the violence, right? So I argue that and I think I've learned this lesson over 5 decades from different places. And so I think that part of the reason why we struggle so much in our country and in every country in the world with rape is because we are fooled into thinking, we are all socialized into thinking about it as a kind of sex, as bad sex, as inappropriate sex, as sex, but actually the first thing I think we need to do is to recognize that that's a lie. That's a central lie, because a world in which we recognize that rape is always violence and never sex is a world in which we deal with it as violence. But for as long as we deal with it as though it's sex, then we have all the stuff. Because what else do we know about sex? Oh my God, it's private, it's messy. I mean, we know the other things. We know it can be delicious and sticky and fabulous. But we don't talk about it, right? Even that has to be secret. So even so, when it's fabulous, it's like it's private. It's inappropriate to talk about.
I talk about it.
No, I'm just saying we socialize not to, right? I mean, obviously, I'm like a liberated company here, right? People getting, vibrate, this is the world we want to get to, right? And I mean, of course, this is how we should be, it's okay, this is part of how we should be talking about sex. But violence is something else, right? And we know that, but for as long as we think about rape as sex, then we bring the hangovers we have about sex to rape. But the problem is that because it's only disguised as sex, and it also is part of how we are terrorized. It means that we're protecting the things that make it terrorizing because we are we're kind of carrying the squeamishness of sex into something that isn't sex. Whereas when we start to recognize that rape is not for sex, then it becomes very difficult for us to say things that we mean well when we say, but that are actually part of the problem. Then we stop saying things like, that's a particularly brutal rape. But we don't say that's a particularly brutal stabbing. We recognize that there's no way to stab nicely. Right? We recognize like every stabbing is like, it's horrible. None of us want to be stabbed nicely. Because it's, and so we then can't say it's a particularly bad, brutal rape. We also then don't say, what kind of person rapes a baby? Because then we recognize it's got nothing, if we know it's got nothing to do with sex, then we don't automatically, by accident, suggest that it's okay to rape a grown woman, right? Because if we're saying what kind of person, it suggests that there's a normal kind of person can legitimately think about raping non-babies, right? And we then pretend that when you're raping an adult woman, or an adult man, or an adult person who's gender fluid, it's a different thing from raping but because we don't have sex with babies, because you can't have sex with babies. But it's so much in the architecture, in the skeletons even of our societies to think about it. But that's how it works. It's important for rape crisis, for the crisis of rape, for rape culture, that we make that kind of slippage into thinking about it as sex. And in our context in South Africa, it's at the very heart of our legal system. Our legal system, our official criminal justice system, is founded on the idea that there are permissible forms of rape. And a big part of it is in what happens under slavery and under colonialism. So that idea that you cannot rape enslaved women, right? So if you call the place where you routinely rape people, where you're, because it can't, it's the Cape's first brothel, but it can't be the first brothel, because if you're an enslaved person, and if we think about who were the women who were who were there, they were women who tried to escape and were put back in there, so it's a prison. There were women who were waiting to be sold, so they're not people legally. And so when powerful Dutch and British men go in and they check them out, it's official, legislated, permissible rape, but then we call it the first brothel to suggest that there was something transactional, but enslaved women can't, right? And then because it's powerful people, so that's like, it's sedimented into the very way we think about what is legal in our society. And then you put on top of that a literal court system that at the very beginning refuses to rule in ways that recognize that enslaved women could ever be raped, right? And the one time when it makes a mistake, because the woman is so fair, the presiding officer misreads her as white. As soon as he finds out she's white, he reverses and so what does that mean structurally? And I mean, I think this is important because this is what our legal system is. And then on top of that, in colonial warfare, if you think about the fact that when the British in what is now the Eastern Cape, for example, when the part of how they celebrate winning battles is that so you kill the men and then you go in and you rape the women, right? So we talk, and this is not kind of specific to the Eastern Cape, it's kind of part of what we see with colonial warfare. And now we sit in 2022 and everybody says rape is an automatic part of warfare. Well, it wasn't. Outside of a very small few countries in Western Europe, until 300-400 years ago, most of the world did not attach rape and war. But these things become normal, and now they become commonplace, right? And of course, even then, we're thinking, well, it's permissible. It's permissible because it's sex. And I think we absolutely have to think about it as, we have to think about rape the way we think about being shot or being stabbed, and recognize it as violence. And because certainly when we think about people being stabbed, we don't fixate on the knife and say, what else do knives do? They help us eat. So it's a kind of eating. It sounds crazy. But I think it's important for us to recognize that thinking about rape as sex is as crazy as thinking about a stabbing and someone being stabbed and thinking about how you like to eat your apple or how you like to eat whatever you cut and you enjoy. They have nothing to, it's just a, sorry, I've kind of gone on there. I'm going to get off my soapbox now and sit down.
We must still get to unrapeable, but let me get through these two because
can
I'm
I
also
say
watching the
something
time.
about that? Can I add something
Sure.
to that? So, I mean, and without giving too much away about my book, I was interested in notions of violence, gender-based violence, and I really wanted to work with, because, as you say, the more brutal the manifestation of violence, the more we kind of sit up as a society and go, oh, look, this is terrible. So I was really interested in working with the less overt forms of violence that we don't as a society go like, oh my God, that's so terrible. So psychological and emotional violence, for example. And getting people to think about the fact that, I mean, and I'm sort of going about this in a roundabout way, but Rebecca Solnit talks about how we all create a notion of ourself, that in fact it's our life's work, creating the notion of self, of who we are. And this act of becoming only finishes when we die, right? And that in that process, in our relationships with other people, that when we, within the boundaries of defining self, can only see and feel our own feelings and thoughts, and the boundaries are such that we withdraw from the feelings and thoughts and the ways in which we potentially hurt others, that, that it's in a sense, it's a form of data streaming, like how I see and feel you is a way in which I absorb you, and how we become normalized into forms of more subliminal violence and psychological abuse, and in not thinking and feeling the other person in front of us.
So when I come back to you, I'm going to ask you about Lolly's drinking problem. But let me go here. And one of the characters in your book says the role, because they also drink to forget. And the one character asks, but why do we drink so much? And Hendrik says, the role of alcohol is our love language. It shocked me because it's so true and so violent. And yeah, so in your book, because yours will come to, how does alcohol as an aesthetic play out, but also as a tool of violence in your book?
So I think in my book I also try to contextualize these contemporary relationships that seem very non-violent within the very violent landscape of Afrikaner patriarchy, which is basically the system of colonial rule and white supremacy. And the one character is an artist, and her big project that she becomes famous for is she paints portraits of families, and they seem just like normal families. It seems like a nice painting of a family, but these are families that have been killed in family murders, and a family murder is when the man kills the wife and the children and then himself. And this was a major thing in the late apartheid, in the 80s and 90s in South Africa, where just a very unusual amount of family murders happened. And it's uncertain whether it was specifically a white Afrikaner problem, but the white Afrikaner community understood it as a white Afrikaner problem, which already says something about where our heads are at. But so it's this extreme form of violence within this nuclear family space, within these heterosexual relationships that kind of underpin this whole structure, and it's very tightly connected to systems of white supremacy and coloniality in general, of course, as a patriarchal machinery. And so I think then something like alcohol in my culture is a form of escape. It is a form of I think also for the men, we cultivate a masculinity where men can't easily speak about how they feel and can't express deeper feelings. Alcohol helps with that. So I think for a culture that is so guarded in itself and so anxious about its own boundaries, something like alcohol offers relief. But then, of course, it also becomes a catalyst for new violence, or not new violence, old violence, but the expression thereof. So yeah, I'm always, because I also love drinking wine, and often too much of it, and I really feel it's something I've inherited. It feels like it sits in my DNA in a way, and my characters also experience that to an extent. And it's interesting for me that you also identify with it, because sometimes I wonder if it's just me and the people I know, but
so alcohol for Lolly is an escape. It's also a way of poor Sadiq. There's a glass or two in the end after Lolly. Knowing that the problem in the colored community of fetal alcohol syndrome, and I mean, when they look at us, they go like, and yeah, daar gaan die dronkies. How does an author in 2022 highlight it? And because it's, it's fiction, so but we learn through fiction that it's actually how important do you think you have taken on that particular task, or not, in your book?
So when I used alcohol in the book, it was in very conscious ways, and it was to do two things. I think on the one hand that the alcohol is important as part of who Lolly is. She's debaucherous. She's give me whatever makes life more decadent. She's like in front of that line, grabbing for things. But there's also, because of her background and her experience of violence, there's a sort of psychic numbing that she does, a sense of disassociation. And in a sense, that's why she creates an alter ego that helps her navigate through the world. So this other Lolly, that she's two people, and the one is the good girl, and the other one is the bad girl. And in fact, when she has moments of actually seeing them, there's one scene where Lolly's making tea, but the other Lolly is going like, oh my God, like, let's do the expensive wine, dude. So, you know, it was also, I mean, there's also a scene, so as with the alcohol, where she finds that Sadiq has been taking tranquilizers, but he's hid this from her, so she finds it in his cupboard under some T-shirts. And she's super angry because, one, he's got nothing to be anxious about. She's fixing their lives. Like, why is he doing this? You know? And two, if he's doing it, he needs to tell her. But then what she actually does is she secretly uses the pills. So it is about this notion of numbing down trauma. And that's what I was trying to do with the alcohol there.
Okay, so we almost there. When you've listened to these two stories and read, what from a feminist perspective could you illuminate us with of your understanding of these two very different perspectives?
I mean, I think that's several things. I think I'm loving Azille's response to what it means to think about relationship and kinship in ways that do not, that don't center men, but also don't center specific kinds of relationships with men. So what does it look like when we think? Because I mean, I think that's crucial to thinking about. Not that we're going to kill all the men. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just like it don't have to be a reference point for everything. And to think about and to put that not as kind of support characters, because often kind of friendships between women are either spectacular, like in fiction, in film, in whatever. So in so much of the culture we consume, I mean, they don't reflect how we really live our lives, right? Which is often that they're at the very heart of your life, but often they're just kind of the site of unnecessary drama. Messy. And I just often think like, really? This is how other people, because I think, I've been friends with some people for 20, 30 years, and there's very little drama. But you watch kind of, Sex and the City, there's constant competition and drama and kind of restain. So I'm loving this idea of, well, it's about exploring a whole range of worlds, but at the center of this world is it's all infracted. It's looked at through, I don't know how to say this word, through kind of how women think about the world and think about each other and think about themselves in relation to that, without necessarily creating kind of a utopia. So I'm really kind of loving that. I haven't read an entire Afrikaans novel in many years, but I think this might be the one that, since my 20s, but I think this might be the one that breaks it.
I started it last night, it's very good.
And then, of course, in the other me, I think that it's just, Lolly, I love Lolly. Look, I don't want Lolly in my real life. Right? Because, woo, Lolly.
Messy.
But as a character, are you kidding me? I just found her incredible, as a character, as a reader, I found her so incredibly freeing, right? Because I think that she kind of pushes, certainly me. I haven't finished, I don't know, maybe I'm going to change my mind. But so far, pushes me so much to kind of think about a whole range, which is what the greatest fiction does often, right? To think about what is scary, to think about what is possible, to take the thought of kind of desire for a certain life, I mean, a certain relationship with power and control, further than the place that we often scared to say, you know, to kind of own up to. And then I think in terms of the alcohol thing, I mean, I think, oh my God, I think it's going to be great reading them, these novels together, because I think that, I mean, everywhere we look, there's so much glamorization of alcohol, right? And even as we all know that it's a big part of how we self-medicate, right? So I'm thinking like Lolly uses alcohol in all of these ways, but it's, and it's part of how she manages and controls and gives herself permission to do certain things, but it's also such a big part of her, the original wounding,
Yes.
right? And it's just says something about all of these kind of, I mean, we live in the, you know, we are a country of serious drinkers. And we can't think about celebrating without alcohol. We can't think about suffering without alcohol. We can't think about history without alcohol. And so all of those kind of incredible layers. Yeah, I mean, I'm just really excited about finishing and about starting these two novels. And yeah, so.
Yeah, I do think that one, if you read the three at the same time.
Well, I kind of have read the other one, sort of.
Sure. You know but for the audience, if you read the different perspectives and then you go either first there and understand the two, or read the two and then understand it from hindsight. There's still a lot to unpack, but the hour is done. Like there's an analogy of that I didn't know about the boerboel and its relevance to Afrikaner culture that we haven't even picked on. And in yours, well, the ending, people, let me not spoil it for you, but the ending, in both, but more dramatically so over there. And then, of course, Pumla's from a more academic perspective.
But my ending isn't academic.
Hey?
My ending isn't academic.
No, it's not. But if we don't think about it, because we think we are not clever, or I do, I don't speak for other people, and that we can't read, for example, stuff that pushes our buttons and boundaries and make us want to understand and read more, then that's it. If there are, thank you, ladies, women,
Thank you, Ingrid.
females,
Thank you, Ingrid.
gender neutral people. Can we have one question? Not even. Okay, that guy, that orange at the back, second row. Yes, that's the only question that will be allowed. A shorty one and a short answer, please. That's a fantastic question. I am unfortunately, because that lady's going to kill me over there, I'm not going to answer to them, but I'm going to ask the open book, because it's a fantastic question. If we can't have these things we do on Zoom nowadays, or whatever, where one can engage with the authors after the fact, so that you can, and maybe they can ask next year, put that as one of the questions, because it's a great question. So sorry that I will not allow you to, that sounds terrible, to answer now, but yeah, time, and maybe I think there's a little bit of time now in between for you to engage with the authors, to ask them what they, but thank you, you were fantastically quiet, that's lovely. We'll see you next year.